Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Peiches, Daf 88 of Masechta Pesachim. Well, the first part of the Daf, we kind of conclude the Agaditas that we began yesterday, which I think maybe some of us found interesting, right? I think, what can I tell you? You guys don't tell me. I'm kidding. Anyways, Balabayas slaughtering. Yeah, what are we talking about here? Balabayas slaughtering. Aha. Yeah, we're talking about the who kind of by default gets included in the korban Pesach of the homeowner of a homeowner. It's interesting. We're going to see a sugya that seems extremely similar to a sugya that we learned in Eruvin in terms of who is Yotze with the Eruv. With the Eruv of a father or husband. Yeah, I don't see that Gemara in Eruvin quoted anywhere in the Daf, but it strikes me as being very, very, very similar. And then we'll continue really going through our Mishnah, and then we get to a new Mishnah, which discusses a slave who slaughters a korban Pesach for his master. Okay, we're going to begin on Daf Pei Zayin. About 10 lines from the bottom at the 2 dots. Tani Reb Chia taught my dichsiv. What does the pasuk mean? Elokim haven darka v'yodas mikoma. That the Eibishter understands its ways and he knows its place. Yodea Kadosh Baruch Hu as Yisrael she'einon yichol lekabel gzeros achzarios Edom. That the Eibishter knows that the Yidden would not be able to handle the gruesome decrees of Edom. Leficha chigla osam lebavel. That's why he exiled them to Bavel. I mean, at this point, we're kind of all over the place. There's Chabad houses in who knows where. Akoponim. V'amar Rebbe Elazar, and says Rebbe Elazar, Lo higla HaKadosh Baruch Hu es Yisrael leBavel, elam pnei shamuka kish'ol. Says Rebbe Elazar that the reason why the Eibishter exiled the Yidden to Bavel was because it's as deep as hell, I guess, as the abyss. How does that sound? Shneimar, as the pasuk says, miad sheol efdeim mimaves egalem, because the pasuk says that I will redeem them from the abyss and from death, and therefore, if the Eibishter exiled us to such a place, he will also redeem us from that place. Reb Chanina Amar, mipnei shekarv l'shonim l'lashon Torah, because the speech of the Babylonians is similar to the speech of the Torah, to the language of the Torah, and therefore somehow through the similar language we'll be able to preserve the Torah for longer. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Shigun leveis imon. Well, the Eibishter sent us back to our mother's house. For example, if you have a husband who gets upset at his wife, he sends her back to her mother's house. V'hanu Rabbi Alexandri. And this is like what Rabbi Alexandri says, that there are 3 things that went back to their roots. Eluhain, these are them. Yisrael Kesef Mitzrayim V'Chesef Luchis V'Uchsav Luchis. The Yidden went back to their roots. The money that was taken from Egypt went back, as well as the writing that was on the first luchos. Let's see. Yisrael Adamaran. So the Yidden, that which we said, that we went back to Bavel, which is, as Rashi points out, Ur-Kastim, which is where Avram Avinu is from, and I guess that was Bavel. Kesef Mitzrayim Dichsiv. Right, because it says that when we left Egypt, that we took a whole bunch of good stuff from there. But it also says, the pasuk says, "Vayibashana chamishis." It was in the 5th year, lemelech Rechavam, al Shishak melech Mitzrayim al Yerushalayim begomer, that the king of Egypt came and took back everything that was taken when the Yidden left. Ksava luchis, and how do we know that the writing on the first luchis went back to its source? The pasuk says, "V'hashabrim le'nechem," and I broke them in front of your eyes. Tana. And we learned in a brayso, luchos nishbru va'osios porchos, that the tablets broke and the letters, the writing on the tablets, flew up to the heavens. Ula Amar Kadeshiyochlu Tamarim V'Yasku B'Torah. Ula says that the Yidden were exiled to Bavel so that they can eat dates and learn Torah. That sounds very pleasant, right? Eat dates, learn Torah. maybe Babylon Talmud, maybe one time we'll eat dates and learn Torah. Sounds like it would be very nice. Now here's a story that I had always remembered, but I had no clue where it was from. And here it is, on Daf Peiches of Masechta Pesachim. Ula ikla le Pumbedisa, Ula visited Pumbedisa. Istama, who was there at the time? I assume he was probably visiting Rav Yehuda. Krivule Turina de Tamri, and they brought for him a basket of dates. Amrlu, and he said to them, Kama kiane bezuze? He says, wow, how much does something like this cost? How much does a basket of dates cost? Amrule tlas bezuze, you can get 3 baskets for 1 zuz. Omar, he said, whoa, wow, Melotzana de duvsha bezuza, uvavlo aska ba'araisa. And he gave them a shtickle musar. He says, here you are in a place where you can get so many delicious dates for so cheap. Why don't you learn more Torah? Belil yatzaru, but that night, all these dates that he ate, were mistama. They were giving him a run for his money in his stomach. Omar, he said, Melotzona sama de mosa bezuza bibavel uvavloi aski beoraisa. Which then he turned around 180 degrees and he said, wow, here you could buy baskets full of poison in Bavel, and yet they still learn Torah. So at the beginning he basically was giving them musar, like, here you have all this amazing dates for so cheap, why aren't you learning more? And then at night when he was feeling sick, he says, holy cow, there's all this poison in Bavel, and yet the Babylonians still manage to learn Torah. That's pretty amazing. Vamar Belazar, it says, Belazar, what does the pasuk mean? V'holchu amim rabim, that many nations will go, v'amru, they're going to say, L'chu v'nayle, el har Hashem el beis Elokei Yaakov v'gomer. Let's go to the mountain of God, to the house of the God of Jacob. Elokei Yaakov v'lo Elokei Avram v'Yitzchak. What? Just the God of Jacob? What about the God of Abraham? What about the God of Isaac? So not like Avram, that it says about him a mountain. That it will be said today that the Eibusher will be revealed Bahar, on a mountain. And not like Yitzchak, that it says about him a field. As the pasuk says, that Yitzchak went out to speak in the field, i.e. to pray in the field. At least that's how we learn it. Eleki Yaakov, rather, we're saying we're going to go to the house of the God of Jacob, Shekro Bayis, that Yaakov referred to God as a house, Shenema Vayikra Shema Makom, or referred to the mountain, to Har Moriah, as a house. Shenema, as the pasuk says, Vayikra Shema Makom Ahu Beis El, that Yaakov Avinu called this mountain Beis El, the house of God. So because Yaakov Avinu referred to Har Bayis as a house, so that's a more sort of comfortable. Rashi says Shekro Bayis Makom Yushav, a place, a settled place, and it's more comforting, I guess, and homey to be referred to as a house rather than a mountain or a field. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan says that the inbringing of the exiles is going to be like the day that the world was created, that heaven and earth were created. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, "V'nikbetzu b'nei Yehuda v'nei Yisrael yachdav," that all of Judah and Israel will gather together. V'samulem rosh echad, and they're going to appoint one leader, v'alu min haaretz, or at least one intention, and they will come up from the land, Kigadol Yom Yisrael, that this day, as Rashi points out, of like Kibbutz Galus is great. And it was evening and morning, it was one day. So we see it says Yom in both of those contexts. So we see that the day of the ingathering of the exiles will be as great as the day on which the heaven and earth were created. Yosem sheshachtu olav apetropsin v'chulei. So the Mishnah had said, if you have a orphan and he is being cared for by 2 representatives, and both of those representatives slaughtered a korban Pesach, so we're saying that the orphan, that this child can choose to partake from whichever korban pesach he wishes. Shmas mina yesh breira. So the Gemara wants to say, let's infer from here that there is breira. Of course, we've seen breira a few times already. That from the fact that he could choose at the time that he's eating the korban pesach which one he wants to eat, so we can go back in time and say that this was the one that he intended to be part of at the time that it was slaughtered. Because of course, you have to be part of a group that eats the korban pesach, and you can't be part of more than one group. And therefore, we would have to. So if you're going to eat from the korban pesach of Ruvain, the apotropos, so then memele retroactively, you had to have had intention that you wanted to be part of the group of people eating from Ruvain the apotropos' korban pesach. So the Gemara wants to argue from the fact that we're saying that this Yasom can choose whichever korban pesach, either from Ruvain the apotropos or Shimon the apotropos. So then that implies that we could say breira and go back in time and say whichever one he chooses. So then at the time of Shechita, that was what his intention was. So answers Reb Zera, Reb Zera sele bayis mikol makom. So says Reb Zera, no, that isn't why. It's because the pasuk says sele bayis, a pasco, a sheep for the household, and the implication and the limud is, and as we're going to learn now in more detail, that it goes based on the balabais. If you can have the balabais, the sort of leader of the house, slaughter a korban pesach, and then everybody in the house kind of comes along with him. Anybody who may be, children, whatever it is, we'll get to details in a second, would be included in that by default. And here also, by the two apotroposes, because they are caring for this child, so he kind of goes along with their with kind of their korban pesach. He goes with the flow, and therefore we can assume that it was acceptable to this child to be to be part of their korban pesach. Whether it's Reuven the apotropos or Shimon the apotropos, both you can assume that at the time that the shechita happened, the child was happy to kind of go along with it. As we're going to see that, for example, a father can slaughter a korban pesach for his young children, and whether they like it or not, they go along with it. So here also, whichever one this child ends up eating, he was included in it by default. And here we go. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, and this is a sugya that I think is very, very similar to a sugya that we saw in Masechta Eruvin regarding a balabayis making an eruv tchumen and who by default is included. Anyways, but here we're talking about korban pesach. Tanu Rabbanan seleve levayis. So there's one sheep per household. That a person slaughters a korban pesach, and by default his young sons and daughters are included as part of the group that will be eating that korban pesach. And included by default also is his non-Jewish servant and maidservant. Ben midaitem ben shelo midaitem. That's whether they knew that this was happening, whether they didn't know that this was happening. And as Rashi points out, even if they protest, it makes no difference. Even if they say, we don't want to be part of your korban pesach, it makes no difference. By default, when the balabayis slaughters the korban pesach, so his young children, his non-Jewish slaves and maidservants are included. Aval eino shochet al yidei bno vito agdolim by the avdov shivchaso ha'ivrim vayad ishto elamidaitan. However, let's read that again. Eino shochet, he doesn't slaughter the korban pesach al yidei bno vito agdolim. He doesn't slaughter for his grown up, for his adult children, by the avdov shivchaso ha'ivrim, or for his Jewish slaves and maidservants, by the ishto or vayad ishto, or for his wife elamidaitan, unless they specifically have intention to be included. So by default, the young children and the non-Jewish servants are included, but not the adult children, not the Jewish servants, and not his wife. Tanya Yidach, we learn in another brayso, lo yishchot adam lo yedei bno uvito agdolim. A person should not slaughter for his adult children, vayedei avdov shivchaso ivrim, or for his Jewish servants, vayedei ishto, or for his wife elamidaitan, unless they have their consent. Aval shochitu ayidei bno vito aktanim, but he does slaughter for his young children, by the adav v'shivchas aknainim, and for his servant and maidservant who are non-Jewish, whether they have intent, whether they don't have intent, even if they have, as Rashi points out, anti-intent, disintent, disapproval, not unwillingness, non-volition. Did I miss a word? Now here is where we get to some more fine-grained nafkaminas. V'chulin sheshachtu v'shachat rabban alein yotzim b'shal rabban v'yotzim b'shal atzman chutz min ha'isha. You hear that? Let's read that again. V'chulan, now all of them, all of these sort of adults, right? Meaning the adult children, the wife, the Jewish, the Jewish servants. Sheshachatu v'shachat rabban alein. What happens if they slaughtered their own Pesach, and the whether the master or the father or the husband also slaughtered his korban Pesach? Yotzim b'shal rabban v'yotzim b'shal atzman. Well, they're going to be included in their father/master's korban Pesach, not the one that they slaughter for themselves. Chutz min ha'isha sheyichola limchos, with the exception being the wife, because she could say, no, I don't want to be included in your korban Pesach, I want to be included in mine. Ma'ishna isha. Now the Gemara says, why should a wife be any different than adult children or Jewish servants? We said, right? Meaning we grouped in one group young children and non-Jewish servants. The rest of the group, the other group was adult children, Jewish servants, and his wife. So why all of a sudden, when we come to the case where they slaughtered their own korban Pesach and the husband slaughtered his own korban Pesach, do we now make a distinction within that group between his wife and his adult children / servants? So Rava says, when it says wife there, it means all of them. Kilu, wife, adult children, Jewish servants. If because they could protest, so therefore if they both slaughtered, so then they would be able to use their own korban Pesach. We said, one second. What's going on over here? This is inherently a question. Amart, on the one hand you said, chutz min ha'isha sheyichola limchos. On the one hand we're saying that specifically a wife, since she, if she slaughters her korban Pesach, so then she could rely upon her own korban Pesach, since she could protest and say that that's what she wants. Time of the machi, implication being that she has to, however, protest. She has to make it clear that she doesn't want to be included in her husband's korban Pesach. Halo machi nafka b'shabayla, but by default, if she doesn't explicitly say that she has no intention to be included in her husband's korban Pesach, well, she'll go along, right? It says demachi, meaning if she protests, if she says, look, I'm not interested in being part of your korban Pesach, so then she won't. But by default, she will be included. But we said initially that his wife, right? It says not by his adult children, not by his Jewish servants, not by his wife, unless they have specific intention and they say, look, yeah, I would like to be included in your korban Pesach. But by default, they would not be included. So on the one hand, we're saying she has to dafka protest in order to be not included, but by default she would be included. On the other hand, we're saying that we dafka have to have their intention, implication being that without it, it wouldn't work. So what do we do? So the Gemara says, "My ella midaiton." So the Gemara says, "No. What? So what does it mean when they specifically, meaning that when it comes to adult children, Jewish servants, his wife, we need their intention. It doesn't mean that they specifically have to say, yes, I would like to be included, right? Lav da'amri in, ela b'stame. No, it means by default we can include them. La'afuk echad amr lo, to the exception of where they say no. That if, so as opposed to young children or non-Jewish servants, that even if they want to protest, it makes no difference. Now, as parenthetically, if you're wondering why do non-Jewish servants have to be in korban Pesach, because they are chayavin b'mitzvos to the same degree that a woman is chayav ves and mitzvos. So they have to do the korban pesach. So by default, they're including the husband's korban pesach, whether they want to or not. So now, but when it comes to adult children or Jewish servants or his wife, so by default they're included, but if they don't want to be included, then they won't be. But it says that all of them, if they slaughtered and their master or father slaughtered, so then it will, meaning if they both slaughtered, they'll go based on their father/masters. The bistama b'katani chutz minisham pnei shichol limchos. That there is, by default, we're saying that they would be included, and yet we're saying that the woman is not included since she can protest. So he said, what do you mean? Well, specifically in that case, she slaughtered her own korban pesach. I mean, it's pretty clear that if she's slaughtering her own korban pesach, then she is making a statement that she's not interested in being included in her husband's korban pesach, and that's why she won't be included. But by default, she would be included. So basically, what we get with this is that when it comes to young children and non-Jewish servants, so then no matter what, they go after the father/master's korban pesach. When it comes to adult children, Jewish servants, and this fellow's wife, so then by default, sure, they'll be included. But if they don't want to be included, then they won't be included. And if they slaughter their own korban pesach, so then that would be considered basically like a saying that they intend not to be included. So the Mishnah had said, if you have a servant of a slave who's owned by two masters, right? So we said that it doesn't work with either one, right? He can't eat from the korban pesach of either one, right? He can't eat from the korban pesach of either master. Ramele Rav Eina Sava, Rav Nachman. So Rav Eina Sava asked the kasha to Rav Nachman. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Evet shel shnei shutvin lo yochel mishel shnein. So our Mishnah says that if you have a servant, a slave who's owned by two partners, so he can't eat from either one of their korban pesach. But we learned in a brisa that actually he can eat from whichever one he wants. So Amarle, so Rav Nachman responds, Eina Sava, the elder Eina, Barmila Pasya Uchama. Those who say the black vessel. Alright, Rashi, there's a Likute Rashi over here which says, Klomar Gam Ata Ragil V'Tadir B'Torah. Okay, so I guess it's some kind of positive reference. Between me and you, we will come to the conclusion over here. We'll get to the end of this. It depends. In our Mishnah, where we say that if you have two owners for one slave, he cannot eat from either one of their korban pesach, it's because they don't get along with each other, that they don't want to get any, right? It's a business relationship that went sour, and neither one wants to get any benefit from the other. And therefore, this slave is owned 50% by two individuals, and each one has no interest in his 50% share getting any benefit from the other one, and for that reason, this slave will be unable to have either korban pesach, because the half of him that is belonged to the other one, that other one doesn't want him getting hana from the other one, if that makes sense. I think it makes enough sense. Since he's jointly owned and neither one wants to be willing to allow their part get benefit from the other person's part. So the Mishnah says that if you have a slave who is owned by two owners, one of them frees the slaves, now he's half slave, half free, so he's not allowed to eat his owner, the one who still owns a 50% stake in him, so he cannot eat from that fellow's korban pesach. So does that imply that, okay, so he's unable to eat from his master's korban pesach, but he can eat from his own korban pesach? We learn in the Brisa, lo yochal lo mishalov lo misharab. We learn in the Brisa that he's unable to eat from his own korban Pesach, just like he's unable to eat from his master's korban Pesach. So he's unable to eat from any korban Pesach. Lo kasha kan k'mishna rishona kan k'mishna achrona. So the Gemara answers, well, when the Brisa says that he would be unable to eat from any korban Pesach, that was like originally, before Beis Hillel changed their mind and agreed with Beis Shammai. Whereas our Mishnah, which implies that he's able to eat his own korban Pesach, that was after Beis Hillel agreed with Beis Shammai. What are we talking about? Titnanis. We learned in the Mishnah, Mishachetzu Eved v'chetzu ben chorin. If you have a fellow who's 50% slave and 50% free, Oved es Rabbo Yom Echad v'esatzma Yom Echad divrei Beis Hillel. According to Beis Hillel, so he alternates, right? He's 50% slave, 50% free. So Imamish switch off days of the week. Sunday he's a slave, on Monday he's free, on Tuesday he's a slave again, Wednesday he's free, so on and so forth. Whereas Beis Shammai says, Takantem is Rabbo v'esatzma lo takantem. He says, look, that certainly benefits the master. He doesn't lose anything. He still has his same 50, he's getting 50%, he's getting the work that he deserves. But this guy is kind of screwed. And he says, because now, from the fact that he's 50% free, he's unable to marry a non-Jewish maidservant. He also can't marry a free, a non-servant woman, because he's still 50% slave. Yivatel, and what are we going to suggest, that he just doesn't marry anybody? The world was created to populate it, to have children. Shneimar, the pasuk says, it wasn't created barren, or to be barren. It's created in order to settle it with people. So, like, this guy's kind of stuck right now, because he's basically in limbo as 50% slave and 50% free. He basically can't do anything. So rather, in order to kind of like fix things in accordance with the way of the world, so Kofin is Rabbu, we kind of force his master Vosa Oso Ben Chorin to make, so even the fellow who owns 50% of this other fellow, so we force the owner fellow to make the slave a free man, and he writes a document on half of his value. Okay, I guess in the context of this transaction, and therefore, so Rashi on the previous page says something interesting, that because on the last Rashi in the previous page says Hoil v'yadeinu l'shachriro, since it's in our power, it's in our hands to free this fellow, so we can treat him like a free person, and he can eat his own korban Pesach. And Beis Hillel then went back and agreed with Beis Shammai, and therefore we kind of take the route where we force the owner to free this fellow, and then he can, and it sounds like Rashi is saying even if he doesn't yet, but because we can force his hand to free this fellow, so therefore he can already eat his own korban Pesach. Says the Mishnah, Omer la'avdo, somebody who says to his servant, now interestingly, this is a non-Jewish servant. The reason why it's interesting is because we're going to see that there's a possibility where maybe he could be bringing his own korban Pesach. Now we had seen just a few minutes ago that a non-Jewish servant, even if he protests, he's unable to bring his own korban Pesach. So Ataka looked it up, and it said in the art scroll there in that it's talking about where the master gave him specific stipulation that he can bring his own korban Pesach, interestingly. Okay, so we're talking about a non-Jewish servant who his master requested that he slaughter a korban Pesach for him, i.e. for the master. So somebody says to his servant, his slave, say, Pesach, please go out and slaughter a korban Pesach for me. So, he didn't specify whether he wants a goat or whether he wants a sheep. So whatever the slave slaughters is what's going to be on the menu. Shachad gedi vitale yochel min harishon. If he slaughtered both, so then eat the first one, and you just got to basically throw out the second one. You got to burn the second one. So whether it's the goat, whether it's the sheep, whichever one was first, that's the one that you will take, and the other one you'll basically throw away. Shachach ma omer lo rabo. Now, what if, unlike this case that we just mentioned, where the master just said just slaughter any korban pesach, and he wasn't makbid on which one, whether goat or sheep? What if the master did specify a goat or a sheep, but the slave forgot, and now he doesn't know what to do? It was before. Remember, it was before WhatsApp. So, shachach ma omer lo rabo. So if the slave forgets what his master requested, he knows that the master said either sheep or goat, but he can't remember which one. Kate said yaise. So what does he do? So what he does is yishchat tale v'gedi. So he'll slaughter both a goat and a sheep. V'yomar, and he'll stipulate im gedi amrli Rabbi. If my master said that he wants a goat, gedi shalo v'tale shali. Well, this goat that I'm slaughtering is for my master, and this sheep that I'm slaughtering is going to be mine. Mine meaning my own korban pesach, which is what I was saying a few minutes ago. That even, in general, what does it mean his own korban pesach? I thought we said that no matter what, he's included in his master's korban pesach. So it has to be where the master gave him some kind of stipulation that he can make his own korban pesach. Anyways, so therefore, if he doesn't remember if his master said a sheep or a goat, so he'll slaughter both a sheep and a goat, and he'll make a stipulation. He says, look, my master said goat, so then the goat is his and the sheep is mine. And if he said sheep, then the sheep is his and the goat is mine. V'imtale amarli Rabbi, if my master said sheep, hatale shalo, then the sheep is his, v'gedi shali, and the goat will be my korban pesach. Shachach rabo ma amarlo. Now if they both forgot, meaning they know that the instruction was to slaughter either a goat or a sheep, but the slave forgot which one, the master, and then he brought them home. The master forgot which one. So now what do you do? So so both of them have to be thrown in the garbage. Basically, they have to go burn. They have to be burnt. They can't be eaten, but they don't have to bring a Pesach Sheni. What this means is that, remember, the master had said to the slave, "Hey, slaughter for me slaughter for me a goat," or he said, "Slaughter for me a sheep." So there was a specific instruction to slaughter a sheep or a goat. Now the slave had forgotten what his master said, so he went and he made some kind of a tanai. He says, "Look, if he said goat, then the goat is his and the sheep is mine. If he says sheep, then the sheep is his and the goat is mine." Whatever it is. Now he brings them back, and the master also forgot what the instruction was. So now here's the thing: a korban pesach can only be eaten for people that are in the group associated with it, which means that the slave slaughtered both korban pesachs with the intention that one was going to be for his master, one was going to be for him. Now, since they both forgot what the instructions were, so you're kind of stuck, because you can't eat either one, because let's say you're eating the other person's, then you're eating the korban pesach that you're not included in. You can't be included in more than one, so you're basically stuck. So you have to burn both korban pesachs. You cannot eat them. However, since one of them, we don't know which one, but one of them was for the master, one of them was for the slave, so they're both yotze, they're chiyuv, we just don't know whose is whose. They basically got mixed together, so therefore they cannot be eaten, but they're both yotze, the mitzvah of korban pesach. Zok the Gemara, pshita shochat gedi yochal avagav d'ragav l'tole. It's obvious that when the Mishnah says that, when in the first case, when the master says, "Hey, slavele, can you slaughter for me a korban pesach?" and he doesn't say that he wants a goat or a sheep, so then shochat gedi, if the slave slaughtered a goat, yochal, well, that's going to be the master's korban pesach, afagav d'ragav b'tale, even though he generally eats sheep, not goats, but he didn't specify sheep or goat, and therefore, if the slave slaughtered a goat, well, that's going to be the korban pesach that year. Shochat tale, yochal, avagav d'ragav b'gdi, and if the slave slaughtered a sheep, that's what's going to be the korban pesach, even though the owner usually would use a goat. Usually eats goats. Okay? When we say that if he slaughtered both a goat and a sheep, then he eats from the first one, right? Meaning we had said that if the master says, hey, slaughter for me a korban pesach, and he doesn't specify sheep or goat, and the slave slaughtered both a sheep and a goat, so we say just take the first one. But we say that you can't do that. You can't be part of two groups. You can't, have two korban pesachs and be part of a group for each of the two korban pesachs. You can't do that because, as Rashi points out, we don't say brera, right? You can't just choose later on at some later point that this is the korban pesach I want, and then we'll go back and say that was your intention at the time that you slaughtered it, because maybe that wasn't your intention. Maybe you dafka, maybe you want it to be included in the other one, and therefore, since we can't know which one he necessarily preferred to have, and we can assume that he does prefer one over the other, but we can't know which one, so therefore, we can't say for sure which one, so therefore it would not work. So how can the slave slaughter both the gedi and the taleh, and then we'll just go with the first one? Maybe, let's say the first one was the goat. Maybe the intention of the owner was that he wanted to taka the sheep. So therefore, how can we say that you'll just go with the first one? So the Gemara answers, Masnisim b'melech v'malka, that our Mishnah, when we say, just go with the first one, it's talking about a king and a queen. As Rashi points out, that a king and a queen, they don't really care if it's a goat or a sheep, at least from this perspective, because they have such geshmaka cooks and everything that they're going to make a delicious meal whether it's a goat or a sheep. And therefore, they're not really involved in the minutia, in like the day-to-day details about whether a dinner is going to be a goat or a sheep. Whatever the chefs in the palace make is going to be excellent. So therefore, it doesn't really matter to them. So whatever it is, they'll be happy, as long as it's prepared nicely, which it will be. So in that case, whichever one was first is what'll work. B'atanya, we learn in a brayse, that you can't be part of two korban pesachs at the same time. Umayse b'melech b'malka. There was a story with a king and a queen. That they said to their servants, "Say v'shachatu aleinu es hapasach, go and slaughter for us a korban pesach, just like in our Mishnah." V'yatzu v'shachtu aleim shnei pesachim, and they went out and they slaughtered two korban pesachs. Bo v'shalu es hamelech, I guess one sheep and one goat. Bo v'shalu es hamelech. So now they came and they asked the shaila to the king. They said, what do we do now? They slaughtered two korban pesachs. What do we do? So Meloim l'chu v'shalu es hamalke. So the king says, go and ask my wife, the queen. Bo v'shalu min hamalka. So they asked a shaila to the queen. Amra loim l'chu v'shalu es Rabban Gamliel. She says, okay, go ask Rabban Gamliel what we should do. Bo v'shalu es Rabban Gamliel. So they asked Rabban Gamliel. Amra loim, he said to them, Malka v'melech d'daitan kala alein yochlu min harishon. The king and the queen, the daitan kala. What that means is that they don't really have a preference, because both are good. Because they have top, the world's best chefs. They're going to prepare them excellently. Either way, it really doesn't make a difference whether it's goat or sheep. They'll both be excellent. So for that reason, just go with the first one. Anan, but us, the regular people, that we don't have the world's best chefs working for us, and therefore we do have a preference. Some people like sheep, some people like goat. So lo nocha lo min harishon v'lo min hasheni, we cannot eat from either one, because you can't be included in two korban pesachs, and therefore neither one works. V'shuv pamachas, and then another time what happened was, this doesn't have to do with korban pesach, but it does have to do with the king, a queen, and Rabban Gamliel. Nimtzes halatoa beveis amid b'chayim. They found a dead sheretz, a dead lizard, which is one of the shmona shrotzim that we learned about Masechta Shabbos. So a dead sheretz was found in the kitchen. Uvikshu l'tamei kol hasuda kula, and they figured, this entire meal must be tameh if a dead sheretz got into it. So they went and they asked the king. So he said, go and ask the queen. So they went to ask the queen, and she said, go ask Rabban Gamliel. Also, so they asked Rabban Gamliel, he said to them, he says, did it fall into something hot or something cold? They said to him, it was hot. It was boiling hot. He said to them, so what you should do is take a cup of cold water and pour it on the lizard. So they went and they poured some cold water on the lizard, and it jerked, kind of started moving. Yeah. And Gamliel said, all right, everybody, sorry for the scare. Enjoy your meal that a live lizard fell into. So thank God Rabban Gamliel came and he saved the day. They were all able to enjoy their meal that a lizard fell into, since it wasn't a dead lizard, it was a live lizard. Truth is, I don't know, I feel like, people eat all sorts of things with dead things in it. Chickens, cows. I don't know, what do you think? What's your take on this story? Basically, you have a king and a queen. A lizard got into the kitchen, fell into the food. They thought they're not going to eat the food because a dead lizard fell into it. It turns out that the lizard was actually alive. So they're like, oh, phew, let's eat this food. Would you eat the food if like a live lizard fell into it? Alright, let's go weiter. So if the slave forgot what his master said to him, right? His master had specifically said a goat or a sheep, but he forgot. So the Mishnah had said what he does is he slaughters both a sheep and a goat, and he makes a stipulation. He says, look, if my master said goat, so the goat is his, the sheep is mine. If my master said sheep, sheep is his, the goat is mine. Shali, what do you mean mine? That which is owned by the servant is owned by his master. How can he possibly have his own korban pesach goat or sheep? So Abai says no. What he does is he goes to a shepherd who the master is a customer, is a regular customer of this shepherd. That this shepherd has the best interests of the master in mind, and therefore he wants to be able to salvage his korban pesach prospects. So what the shepherd does is he davka sells to the or makes a kinyan for one of the animals to the servant under the condition that his master does not have any benefit, any permission over it, and in that way he's able to give it to the slave, and it can be his, and he can make the stipulation that whichever one his master intended for is the one that the master will get, and the slave will get the other one. But if then the slave schleps home these two carcasses, and it turns out that the master also forgot what he had said, so we said that in that case they can eat neither one, but they don't have to bring a Pesach Sheni either. Aha. So Abai says, well, not so fast. When we say that they don't have to do a Pesach Sheni, that is only if the if the master had forgotten what he had said after the Zrika Sadam. That at the time that the Zrika Sadam happened, that the blood was thrown on the Mizbeach, the korban was able to be eaten, because at that point the master still remembered that he had said a goat or a sheep. So then, when he later forgets, so they can't eat them because they forgot which is which. But they wouldn't have to bring Pesach Sheni because they were Yotzei, the korban Pesach, since at the time of the Zrika Sadam, he still remembered. But if the master would have forgotten what he had instructed before Zrika Sadam, that at the time of Zrikas Adam already, you couldn't eat this korban Pesach because you forgot what his instructions were. Chayav Nasos Pesach Sheni. Well, in that case, you would have to bring a Pesach Sheni, as Rashi points out, Shelo Nizrak Adam Lachilas Basar, because his Zrikas Adam wasn't done with, in order to be able to eat meat, because at that point he had already forgotten. And we've seen on several occasions how important eating the korban Pesach is for the korban. And therefore, if already you're doing Zrikas Adam knowing that you'd be unable to eat this korban Pesach, well then, you would have to do Pesach Sheni. There are those who teach Abayi's statement about whether it's before Zrikas Adam or after Zrikas Adam, based on the following Braise. Let's say you had 5 fellows and they all offered a korban Pesach, and as we learned in the other, a few weeks ago already, that after they slaughtered the korban Pesach, they would put it in the hide and throw it over their shoulder and take it back with them. So they already slaughtered their korban Pesach, and now they have the hides, and they don't necessarily know whose hide belongs to which hide is for which korban Pesach. Beseder. They have the hides, they have the korban Pesachs, and then and all of the hides now got mixed up with each other. And then a wart, a wart was found on one of the hides. Now what do? All of the hides got mixed together, so you don't know whose hide belongs to who. A wart was found on one of the hides, that's a mum, makes the korban Pesach pasul. So now they know that one of them is definitely pasul. Now there's 5 korban Pesachs there, one of them is pasul. We don't know whose is whose. So kulin yotzin leveis hasreifa. So all of them have to be burnt, because we don't know whose is whose. So you can't, one of them is pasul. You can't eat a pasul korban Pesach. So therefore you have to burn all of them, because we don't know which is the pasul one. So now, uftum elasus Pesach Sheni, but they don't need to do Pesach Sheni. So Amar Abaye says, lo shanu ela shenisarvu la'achar zrika. Then when we say that they don't have to do Pesach Sheni, that's only when everything got mixed together after Zrikas Adam. The be'idna de izrik dam miya avichazel achila. That at the time of Zrikas Adam, they weren't yet mixed up, and at that point, at least the 4 out of 5 were ra'i la'achila. And the Gemara is going to ask later on, we're going to get to it tomorrow, but one of them isn't able, one of them is pasul. How could we say that they're all part of Pesach Sheni? But anyways, at that point, they weren't yet mixed up. But if they got mixed up already from before Zrikas Adam, chayav and lasos Pesach Sheni, then they would have to do Pesach Sheni. Because at that point already, by the time of Zrikas Adam, they would have been unable to eat their korban Pesachs. So the Mandamu who says that Abaye is going on the Mishnah, then certainly he would say that on the Braisa. Meaning, if on the Mishnah, where both korban Pesachs are kosher, right? The Mishnah is talking about the master and the servant. The master forgot if he said sheep or goat. The servant slaughtered 2 korban Pesachs. They're both kosher. We just don't know which one is which. And Abaye is saying, well, if the confusion happened before the Zrikas Adam, so then you would have to do Pesach Sheni. Well, then certainly you would say, in the case of the 5 korban Pesachs, that one of them is certainly pasul, and it got mixed up, and now we don't know whose is whose. Certainly in that case, if they got mixed up before the Zrikas Adam, you would have to do, they would all have to do Pesach Sheni. Mandamasni Abraisa, but the Mandamu says that Abaye is going on the Braisa, i.e. when the 5 korban Pesachs get mixed up with each other, Avala Masnisin Lo. But on the Mishnah, you could argue that Abaye would say that even if the master forgot what he had said before the Zrikas Adam, you could argue that still they would be parted from Pesach Sheni. Because Kevin the Ksher Ninu, because since both korban Pesachs are kosher, we just forgot which one, what the instructions were. The idkur avichazil achila, and if the master would have remembered, like, oh right, I certainly said goat, well then problem solved. Right? The korbanos themselves are kosher. Kamishmaya Galios, we could say that, the Eibishter knows which one's which, and maybe I can argue that even if he forgot his instructions, the master forgot his instructions before the Zrikas Hadam, you can maybe argue that it would still be kosher. So if you say that Abai is going on the Brisa, then you could say that specifically on the Brisa, where one of them is definitely pasul, then that is where Abai would say that if they got mixed up before the Zrikas Hadam, so then it would be pasul, but maybe by, right, and they would have to do Pesach Sheni, but maybe by the master and the servant, since they're both kosher korbanos, so then maybe you could say that even if they got mixed up, even if he forgot his instructions before the Zrikas Hadam, still it would be a kosher korban Pesach. Friends, that was Daf Peiches of Masechta Pesachim. What did we talk about? The first part of the Daf was like a continuation of those interesting Agaditas from yesterday. The interesting story with Ula when he found out the bargain on dates in Bavel, and first he said, "How could it be that you guys aren't studying Torah all day if you can buy such delicious dates for so cheap?" And then when he got sick, he says, "Wow, it's a wonder that they learn any Torah at all." Right, we discussed a balabayas who is included by default, and those details when it comes to the Korban Pesach of a balabayas, of the husband, father, master. So we say that young children and non-Jewish slaves by default go along with the balabayas' Korban Pesach, whether they like it or not. When it comes to adult children, Jewish servants, or this fellow's wife, so by default they're included in the Korban Pesach, but if they decide that they don't want to be included, then they don't have to be. We discuss a situation, so when you have a slave of two owners, a slave owned by two owners, so if they get along and they don't mind one getting benefit from the other, so then if one of them includes the slave in his Korban Pesach, then it works, but if they don't like getting benefit from one another, so then if the master, then the slave can't be part of either one of their Korban Pesachs. And if you have a fellow who is half free and half slave, so he could bring a Korban Pesach on his own, but he can't be included in the Korban Pesach of the master, since the master does not have intention for the free part of the fellow. And then we got into that, we had a Mishnah at the end which discussed different scenarios of a master instructing his servant, his slave, to slaughter Korban Pesach. Right? If he just says slaughter Korban Pesach stam, so then the slave, whatever he slaughters is fine. If he slaughters a goat, great. A sheep, great. If the master had specifically said either a goat or a sheep, but the slave forgot, so he can make a stipulation. He says, look, whichever one my master had instructed, that will be his, and the other one will be mine. What happens if then he brings them back and the master also forgot what he had said? So we say that in that case, they don't have to bring a korban Pesach, but they don't have to bring a Pesach Sheni, but you won't be able to eat either one of them because memele, you can't eat both of them because one of them is certainly the other person's, and if you guess, you might get it wrong. So basically, you have to burn it. And Abai makes a distinction and says that specifically that's talking about that the master forgot his intention after Zrikas Hadam, that at least at the time of the Zrikas Hadam, it was still able to be eaten. But if he forgot his intention before the Zrikas Hadam, that already at the time that the blood was thrown on the Mizbeach, already you couldn't eat it. So then it would be a problem. There was a shaila that maybe it goes on a different price regarding 5 hides that got mixed up. Anyways, that was Daf Peiches. I hope you enjoyed it. Peace out.